It would have been quite simple had there been a solid reason for war. Had Austria bluntly demanded a protectorate in Serbia, or Germany claimed some concrete prerogative, some strong point or slice of territory either in Europe or abroad, such demands would have been a matter of dispute and therefore a matter of discussion. But there was absolutely no definable area of disagreement, and therefore no problems to be solved, the solution of which would have meant peace. It was this that turned the First World War into an insane amount of destruction. When war broke out, it was almost universally welcomed. Austrian statesmen welcomed the chance to solve nationalities' problems. The French welcomed the opportunity to reverse their dishonor of 1871. The Germans welcomed the opportunity to solve the Austrian nationals' problem and to destroy the rising power of Russia. The British welcomed the chance to destroy German naval power. The people of Europe flocked to this fight enthusiastically. The enthusiasm and national unity was due to the prevalence of chauvinistic nationalism, the relief felt at the end of a long period of tension like the arms race and war scares. People's ideas of what war was like was romantic and unrealistic. It provided a glamorous and romantic escape for young men from the constraints of everyday life, particularly those in unpleasant, repetitive, and unrewarding jobs, or those in debt or odds with their parents, community, or the police. People were also too unsophisticated to resist government propaganda, and people were swept along by mass psychology. Almost everywhere there was an end to internal conflict. In Germany, employees and employers ended all conflict in the interest of victory. The Social Democrats, in theory committed to internationalism, supported the war almost to a man. In Austria and Hungary, the various nationalities of the empire obediently took up arms. In France, the Union was founded to unite socialists and anarchists in a patriotic movement to support the war. Only in Italy did the socialist deputies oppose the war, and people were generally unenthusiastic. The Schieffelin Plan called for German forces to sweep through Belgium and Luxembourg into northern France in a wide arc, enfolding Paris from the west. This would bring about the surrender of France within 6 weeks. German forces would then be rushed across Germany by rail to the Eastern Front in time to meet the advancing Russians. The German attack came to a halt before its objectives had been achieved. Because the Belgian forts offered unexpectedly strong resistance, the Russians attacked Germany sooner than expected, and the German advance was foreshortened, failing to encircle Paris. Meanwhile, the French attacked into Alsace-Lorraine, and they also failed, being repulsed by 300,000 French casualties by the German Seventh Army. When it was realized that the main German army presented the Allies with its flank on the Marne, General Joffre ordered a counterattack with the First Battle of the Marne. From the 5th to the 12th of September, the Germans were forced to retreat, and both armies, seeking to avoid being outflanked, fanned out and dug in. Lines of trenches stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border were created. This was the Western Front. Under these conditions, the instruments of defense, trenches, artillery, barbed wire, magazine, rifle, and machine gun, proved more effective than the instruments of attack, artillery, rifle, and bayonet. As a result, no attack could succeed. Cavalry and unsupported infantry attacks became suicidal. Surprise attacks were impossible. Since an attack could not succeed, the war became a contest of endurance, with each side trying to wear out the other by exhausting its supply of men, guns, and ammunition, or its will to continue. The war became a war of attrition, directed against the enemy's economy and will to continue. This involved the total mobilization of all resources of society and led to total war. The French war effort was undermined by the loss of its industrial north and eastern provinces. France had to depend upon war supplies and financial aid from Great Britain and the United States. In Germany, the British naval blockade prompted scientific research to produce substitute materials for those rendered unavailable. Both sides hastily developed new methods of warfare in order to break this stalemate. In April 1915, the Germans used poison gas for the first time. Its value was limited as, with a change of wind, it could blow back over the lines of the side using it, and gas masks were quickly developed. Both sides resorted to attacks using greater and greater resources of manpower to overcome the defense by sheer weight of numbers. Thus, in 1916, the Germans launched a huge attack at Verdun, but it only cost a huge loss of life as the French defended it, and the Germans suffered almost as many fatalities. The British and the French then launched another massive attack on the Somme, and this merely increased the amount of dead. The Germans improved their defenses with the construction of the Hindenburg Line in early 1917. Allied attacks during 1917 were, as a result, unsuccessful. The imminent arrival of fresh American forces made a German breakthrough early in 1918 imperative. The Entente reorganized its command and placed Marshal Foch as the overall commander. Successive German attacks failed to break through the Allied lines. In August, the British counter-attacked. By the end of September, the front was beginning to move. Fighting along the Eastern Front remained more mobile than in the West. Large areas of territory changed hands. In 1914, the Russians prepared for war more quickly than expected and advanced into East Prussia before von Hindenburg and von Ludendorff defeated them at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes. The Russians also advanced into Galicia and Austro-Hungary before the Germans attacked in Poland to take the pressure off them. During the summer of 1915, the Germans focused their main efforts on the Eastern Front. They drove back the Russians and advanced into Poland and Galicia and captured Warsaw. In order to keep the Russians in the war, the Allies offered her Constantinople and the Straits after the war. In 1916, Russian general invaded Galicia. Romania joined the Allies but was overrun by the Germans in December. Her grain and oil became available to the Central Powers. With the revolution of February/March 1917, there was considerable debate in Russia about whether to continue the war. It was decided to do so, and Brusilov led another offensive in Galicia in July, which failed. With the coup of the Bolsheviks in October, talks were instituted on ending the war. This allowed the movement of German resources from the east to the Western Front. After long negotiations, which ended in the secret Treaty of London in May 1915, Italy joined the Allies. The main purpose of the Italians was to complete the process of achieving independence and unity by taking the last Italian-speaking areas from Austria and Hungary. A front was opened in the Alps against the Austrian. A massive Austrian attack in May 1915 in the Trentino ultimately failed. Another was launched in 1917, which was only helped with the British and French help. Late in 1918, when the nationalities began to defect from Austro-Hungary, the Italians launched their own offensive, which led to an Austrian request for an armistice. By the end of the war, the Italians had lost 1 million men to gain 12 miles of territory. In October 1914, Turkey entered the war on the side of the Central Powers. The stalemate on the Western Front encouraged many to seek to open another front in the Balkans. On January 2, 1915, the Russians appealed for assistance in their war with Turkey in the Caucasus region. It was decided to launch an attempt to break through and seize the Dardanelles in order to open up a supply route to Russia and close a supply route to Central Europe. On February 1915, the British Navy bombarded Turkish shore batteries and occupied Lemnos. Admiral Rochbeck led 18 ships into the straits, but abandoned the attempt after 4 ships had been struck by mines. On April 25th, British, Australian, and New Zealand troops landed. They had no detailed maps or hospital ships. This quickly failed as well. A second landing also failed. The troops were evacuated by December. Some 150,000 were killed. The Christian Armenians of Anatolia had periodically been subjected to massacres by the Muslim Turkish majority, for example in 1894 and 1896, and again in 1909. Between 100,000 to 300,000 were killed, mostly men. The Young Turks, who took power in 1908, decided to Turkify the multinational Ottoman Empire in order to preserve it from disintegration. When the First World War broke out, they saw an opportunity to eliminate the Armenian population of the empire. The Armenian men conscripted into the Ottoman army were killed first in 1915. Then the rest of the adult population was arrested, sometimes massacred in towns, but more usually driven out of towns or forced marches or transported in trains and killed in remote places. The army and local military, assisted by units of convicts specifically released from prison for the purpose, carried out these deportations. The majority in the caravans were murdered by groups of local people or died from exposure or starvation. Most of those who survived the marches died in the concentration camps set up in the Syrian desert. About 1.5 million people were killed. Some were spared during deportation by being taken as slaves, especially women and children. A special agency was set up to distribute the homes, lands, and personal property of the Armenians to the Turks. The Turks systematically destroyed all trace of Armenians, desecrating their churches, burning their libraries, destroying their schools, monasteries, artistic monuments, and historical sites. The flight of many Armenians across the border into Russian-held territory pushed much of the surviving Armenian population into the small area Armenia ruled by the Russians. Out of that region was created the present country of Armenia. Many others became scattered about the world. The extremist nationalists who came to rule over Turkey began to deny that the genocide had ever taken place, and to this day publishes propaganda to deny it or explain it away. This set a precedent for Hitler, who, in discussing his own plans for racial cleansing in the East, remarked, "Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians?" British and Indian troops landed at Basra to safeguard Allied oil supplies in December of 1914. In the summer of 1915, they advanced on Baghdad, where they were defeated by a Turkish army. The British engineered an Arab revolt, assisted by Lawrence of Arabia. To do so, they promised the Arabs a united, independent Arab empire. It's important to note that Lawrence of Arabia was an Irishman. Anyways, in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, they conceded to France that they would control Syria. They also promised a national homeland for the Jews in Palestine in the Balfour Declaration. General Allenby led a British army into Palestine, which defeated the Turks on the 18th of September 1918 and moved on to Damascus. At the end of October, Sultan Mohammed VI negotiated an armistice with the British. In 1914, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson proclaimed U.S. neutrality. Wilson took advantage of the preoccupation of the European powers to consolidate his hold over the Western Hemisphere. He sent troops to maintain U.S. dominance in Mexico, Nicaragua, Haiti, and Santo Domingo. The U.S. also took full advantage of the economic opportunities offered by the war by taking over European markets and increasing its trade on both sides. Arthur Marwick popularized this concept as that of a form of war which might be contrasted with the limited wars of the 18th century. The wars of the 18th century were largely the business of rulers and their armies. Armies were relatively small in size and would maneuver to avoid battle rather than engaging it. Societies would be largely untouched by the impact of war. For example, trade would continue. By contrast, total war envelops a whole society and refers to its all-encompassing character, its severity, total mobilization of the nation's resources for victory, the undermining of existing social and political structures and institutions, colossal psychological trauma. The usefulness of the concept is not unchallenged. Ian Beckett points out that the gradually increasing intensity and magnitude of war during the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries still continues. The war was fought across the world. There were campaigns and colonies in Africa and in the Middle East. The war was fought on land, on the sea, under the sea, and in the air. Aircraft were used for recon and bombing missions. All European powers except Britain introduced conscription by 1914, and Britain introduced it during 1916. The First World War was a war between nations, not rulers. Consequently, civilians became targets. The casualties of the war were appalling. About 10 million men were killed and about 20 million wounded. There were 5 million widows left and 9 million orphans. Large numbers of the wounded were permanently blind or disabled. New forms of killing had been used, like poison gas. Ill treatment of prisoners of war was occasionally resorted to. The Turks had the reputation of being cruelest to prisoners. There was a new bitterness between the population of the powers. Churchill said, "This is no ordinary war, but a struggle between nations for life and death. It raises passions between nations of the most terrible kind." Also, national and racial hatred had been stirred up by the press. In Germany, there was an anti-British campaign, and in the UK, there was an anti-Austria and German campaign. Throughout the 19th century, governments had increasingly interfered more in the details of everyday life as public life became more organized. For instance, they eradicated child labor, they built sewage systems, they gave a maximum working hours. They also provided for compulsory educations. And as nations geared up for a war of attrition, this interference suddenly increased dramatically. Britain was the home of liberalism, yet the government took over industries, companies. They just took some materials. They rationed food. They conscripted people into necessary industries. They also interfered with the public perception of time by passing or introducing the daylight savings time just to increase the workday. On the outbreak of war, most governments handed over massive powers to military leaders, anticipating a short war. But by the end of the war, the empires of Russia, Austria, Hungary, and Germany had collapsed. The Romanov, Habsburg, and Hohenzollern dynasties were dethroned. The Austro-Hungarian and to a lesser extent the Russian empires were broken up. There were also social revolutions, the communist takeover in Russia, and loss of power to traditional aristocracies in Central Europe. 500 years of hegemony were lost within 5 years. War taxation leveled out the existing differences in the levels of wealth. The masses came more and more to share in government. Trade unions were taken into partnership by governments. In Britain, women were given the right to vote after the war as a consequence of their mobilization. Organized religion never recovered its previous level of popular support post-World War I. By 1917, enthusiasm was almost dead except among some civilians. Russia was on the verge of collapse. Many regiments in Austro-Hungarian army were showing signs of resentment and indiscipline. During 1917, there were mutinies in the French army. Soldiers on both sides began to feel a common brotherhood and a resentment of their own civilians. Individual desertions became more frequent. Peace proposals were laid out during that year. For instance, the new Emperor Charles of Austria-Hungary, Lenin, and Pope Benedict all proposed peace. In February-March 1917, the First Russian Revolution took place. The army was near collapse, and by October/November, the Bolsheviks seized control and within weeks withdrew from the war. With the entry of the U.S. into the war, it became clear to the German High Command that unless they broke through the Western Front before fresh supplies of U.S. troops appeared, they would never be able to win. Since U.S. forces were very slow in appearing, a spring offensive was launched, which failed to break through the French and British lines. By late summer, significant numbers of U.S. forces began to appear. By September 1918, it became clear to Ludendorff and Hindenburg that Germany could not win the war. With the arrival of U.S. forces on the Western Front, the last chance to break through had passed, and a war of attrition had become unwinnable. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was disintegrating. The Bulgarians were on the point of surrender. The Turkish army in Palestine had been defeated. A deadly influenza epidemic hit Germany very hard. It was to kill more people than died on the Western Front in that year. The German High Command sought terms for an armistice before the German army disintegrated. This came into effect at 11 p.m. on the 11th of November, 1918. Here's an assessment of the consequences of the war. First of all, Germany was defeated and had to withdraw from France and Belgium. There were over 8 million dead in Europe alone. The human casualties were enormous. Almost 2 in 3 French soldiers had suffered some form of injury. Some men left war convinced pacifists. Others gloried in war and would become fascists. The physical devastation in the battle areas, particularly on the Western Front, was huge. All European belligerents ended the war with huge debts. Their economies had been ruined because they waged war beyond their means. The European markets had been taken over by the United States and Japan, setting up tensions between those two. The U.S. emerged as a world superpower. Also, belief in the superiority of the traditional governing classes of Europe had been destroyed. New and unstable states emerged in Central and Eastern Europe, imbued with nationalism and indignant that their borders did not coincide with what they saw as their national rights. The savagery of the war on the Western Front made it difficult for the French and the British to accept involvement in a similar war in 1940. Promises had been made to the Allies that were not kept, which would cause problems in later years, for instance, to Italy, to the Kurds, and to the Arabs. In particular, incompatible promises had been made to the Arabs and the Jews concerning the future of Palestine. Genocide had been tolerated in Armenia, setting a bad precedent for the future. The vanquished, particularly the Germans, were left with a sense that they had been unfairly blamed for the outbreak of war. They had somehow been cheated of victory by internal traitors, the November criminals, who destroyed the unity of the country, and were being made unfairly to pay for it. Out of this feeling arose Hitler and the Nazi Party, and ultimately the Second World War.